I'd like to introduce to you the Alpha 2. It's the newest of the Infuser series line of professional injection equipment for the RTM process. And what we're going to go over today is how to set the unit up. Fresh out of the crate, this is what you would have. Is the system's ready to go. You virtually have little setup that you actually have to do as far as assembly. But what we'll start with is we're going to energize it by plugging in the power supply. Now, one of the benefits of the Alpha 2 is that it operates at 24 volts. So while you plug the main power supply into your mains power, here in the States it'd be 110 volts, but rest of the world it could be higher than that, it could be 220 or what you have. But you plug this into the wall and the unit then will only see 24 volts, so you're at a very safe level of power at the unit's source of the operator's contact. So we're going to start off by powering the system up. Now, that power supply simply plugs in here as well. So now we're powered up to 24 volts. We encourage you to start the unit with the E-stop pressed. Always a good way to start out is to have the E-stop pressed. We don't have any concerns of something moving. Normally it would never move anyway, but we'd like to start out that way. Next, I'd like to show you that you have to supply air to the unit. So this would be your main supply air line. It's a 10 millimeter line with the fitting that you would supply for your hose disconnect. So that would connect to your plant air supply. This is your catalyst reservoir, so you would fill that with the particular catalyst that you're using for your resin system. The black hose feeds into your 5-gallon pail or your 55-gallon drum, or could be plumbed into a main system, but that would be your resin supply line there, the black hose that you see. This is your catalyst pump, and behind it is the resin pump. The resin pump is the larger pump, and it displaces 100 cc's for every complete stroke. So a stroke is either from the very top to the bottom or from the bottom to the top. In either direction, the resin pump will dispense 100 cc's of resin up to the mix head. The catalyst pump will put out from 0.5% up to 3% in volume compared to the resin pump. So depending upon where we have this setting here on the slave arm, by moving the catalyst pump upper rod position on the slave arm, you're going to change the relationship of the volumetric displacement of this catalyst pump to the resin pump. Obviously the resin pump stays constant because it's supplied by the air power supply here, the cylinder on top. So it has a constant 4-inch or 100 millimeter stroke. And for every stroke of the resin pump, it directly moves the slave arm, and by changing this position along the slave arm, you change the stroke length of the catalyst pump. Here we have our catalyst output hose. This is the feed hose to the mix head, high pressure hose, and then we have a safety overpressure. If you witness catalyst in this clear tube dispensing back into your container, you have a blockage in the system. This is a safety bypass. So we watch for that. If we notice catalyst in there, well then we realize we have a blockage in the system. So catalyst is passing up to the mix head. We have a check valve at the entrance here and a 3-way valve for catalyst. Now the handle of the valve is shaped somewhat like an arrow. When the arrow is pointing outward as it is now, the point of it is coming away from the mix head. That is going to say that the catalyst coming up to the head will then return down this black line and return back to the catalyst jug. So the catalyst will recirculate and not enter into the mix head with the valve in the position that you see here. The resin valve is the same thing. As long as the resin valve handle is in the horizontal plane, then the resin will come from that drum or pail that you're dispensing from, through the resin pump, up to the mix head resin valve here, and return back, and this hose would be your return line for recirculation of resin. This too would be back into the container that the resin is coming from. So what the system is enabling you to do is recirculate both resin and catalyst prior to injection. And especially for filled systems, that's very beneficial to recirculate. But even with non-filled resins, making certain that your catalyst has no air pockets in the line. Some of the catalyst peroxides tend to gas. Or that you have no entrapped air in the resin line. It's always a good practice to recirculate for a minute or two before we inject. Now, this is obviously the safety cover for the catalyst slave arm, and that should be in place at all times when the unit is operating. I took it off simply so we could see how to make the adjustment on catalyst ratio. Normally that adjustment's made, the cover's reinstalled, then you could take it off e-stop and begin your setup. There are virtually very little that you have to adjust on the Alpha 2. One of the things that you can adjust and do want to pay attention to is the pump speed. So the lower regulator here on this pneumatic tree is the pump speed regulator. This is going to control the flow rate of the resin entering into the mold. We want to maintain that as a constant. That's what we're real focused on, is the flow rate. We want to consistently fill that mold the same way every time. But what we don't want to do is overpressurize it. So to prevent the pressure exceeding our maximum limit that we've set, we can set the actual injection pressure here with this upper gauge. So this regulator and gauge that you can read represents the true actual pressure that's going to be dispensed from the outlet of the static mixer or the mix head, and a tube that would feed from this point here, which is the outlet of the mix head. The mixed resin would be coming through this line, and there would be normally a 3/8 or 10 millimeter tube, polytube, that would be connected to the mold, and that's what we would inject into the mold through. And by setting that value of injection pressure here, we are in effect going to control precisely the resin pressure that's leaving this mix head. This is going to communicate to the resin pump. And when we have set a value here that is, let's just use an illustration. Let's say we set that at 6 psi. So we set that gauge at 6 psi here. Well, then what will happen, it will pump at the speed we have it set to the rate of which this gauge, this regulator down here is set for. The pump will pump until the resin pressure behind this diaphragm exceeds 6 psi. The moment it exceeds it, it'll send a signal through this yellow line and tell the resin pump, slow down, hold on, you're getting up to that limit. In fact, you've met the limit, stop. So momentarily, the pump will actually stop and then just slowly build back up. Now, that system is the unique feature that you must have to control, especially in light RTM process, where we don't have heavy tools clamped in a press. We've got to slow ourselves down and we've got to keep the pressure down, but we want to manage the process by the speed. So you set your speed at a rate that will not cause the pressure to meet the limit, and then set that limit to prevent anything that's been caused as a blockage, wrong fiber, something's going on in the tool, to stop the pump so we don't overpressurize the mold. Very, very, very important feature. This would be a disconnect that's connected to that poly tube. It just comes with the system. So now we have on the back side, we have our flush system. I won't be able to show you without spinning the machine around, which we're not going to do here, but what you have is you have two check valves. You have an air and a solvent check valve. So when we call out for a flush, and the flush is programmable, air, solvent, air, and we can adjust the volume of air, the amount of solvent, and the amount of air for every flush cycle. What we have is we do not pressurize a whole container of solvent. You have a simple 5-gallon pail holding either your waterborne solvents or your acetone or what you may be using, and that's pumped through a clever little diaphragm pump, pneumatically powered diaphragm pump. So when we hit flush, we get a timed amount of air, then we get a timed amount of solvent that's pumped, and then we get a timed amount of air again. So very efficiently, it will clean out the mix head, because again, the mix head is bringing catalyst in. When I turn that valve to point into the head, catalyst will enter the head. When I put the valve in the vertical plane for resin, the resin will enter the head. Now those two components are inside the mix head coming together, being pumped by the resin and catalyst pump. Inside the mix chamber here, we have a static mixer that's in effect just stirring that resin and catalyst together. It comes out mixed. We've talked about how we control the pressure. Now we've stopped the injection. It's always a good, at that point, to turn your valves to research so you don't forget. Then hit flush after you've disconnected from the mold. And we'll go through that flush cycle that I described. Okay, now let's talk about some of the other features. As we've said, we can adjust the catalyst ratio by simply turning the screw, or on some models, it's sliding in the slot that's on the slave arm. There's more than one model slave arm. Generally the same principle, however, is the position of the upper connection to the catalyst pump, the rod as it were of the catalyst pump, where it's positioned on the slave arm directly impacts the ratio. Now, when you filled your catalyst jug with catalyst, first thing you're going to do is prime the pump. So having that stainless braided hose in a vertical plane as much as possible, you simply prime the pump, and you'll see catalyst going back to the jug through that black line. And after you've seen it, you've witnessed it coming through by simply opening the cap and looking inside, then what you'll want to do is pump it vigorously, so 10, 15 more times, just to be certain we've got a good solid prime. And then you can reconnect the line. Now, I've reconnected it now, and that would be under the premise that your resin pump was already primed. If you haven't primed the resin pump at this point, you would leave the catalyst pump disconnect. Just a good practice, because occasionally when you're priming, your resin pump can get away from you if you're not careful at the pump speed you've set it at. So at this point, what you'd want to do is put the pickup wand in the 5-gallon pail of resin and have your catalyst pump disconnected and put your pin back in the top. And what we'll do is when we get to the recirculation mode here that I'll show you in a moment, you'd recirculate until the resin pump picks up the prime, and you'll see that you've got this back in the resin reservoir, your resin back going into the 5-gallon pail, or the drum as it were. Well, let's talk about the controls so that we can enable it to do the recirculation. We show here, if you could, we'll show you when we're going to zoom in on this screen, because all the information, everything that's going on in real time can be viewed right on the screen. Right now that screen is indicating emergency stop, telling you that the E-stop button is depressed. So what we're going to have to do, we spin the button and that will release the E-stop. Now with it powered up and off of E-stop, your control unit will allow you to do all of the functions that are common to the molding process. You can be into a recirculation mode, you can be in a manual inject mode, or you can be in an automatic inject mode. In every case, though, we can start and stop the pump movement by simply one button. Start, green, red, stop. And the pump starts and stops instantaneously. Now, in your manual, you can review how to set the parameters for counts. How many counts will it take to fill that mold? Well, that number is programmed into your counter here. And in an automatic mode, if you're in the automatic injection mode, you've got the counts entered into the preset value, going into the preset table, setting in the number of counts. You simply connect the line to the mold, set your pump speed at the prescribed setting, your injection pressure at the prescribed setting, and you simply hit start. And the pump will inject. Now, I jumped ahead a little bit. You do want to be certain that you've got the resin valve and the catalyst valve in the inject mode. With those in the inject mode, then you hit start. The Alpha 2 will then begin dispensing the resin into the mold, and at the time that the pump counts have satisfied the preset, it'll automatically shut off. You won't have to hit stop. It'll have already stopped. Then you would simply disconnect the line from the mold, aim that line into a waste container, and push flush. Pressing flush once will give us a burst of air that we've programmed in, how long that air segment is. Then it'll give us solvent. The amount of time the solvent value is there, it relates to the exact volume of solvent that we get, and then drying air, so that our mix head is completely cleaned of catalyzed resin, and the line that's feeding to the mold from the mix head is also flushed out, so you don't waste that each time. At that point, you're ready to go on to your next molding, or to stop for till the next activity of molding comes up. So again, you can automatic inject, you can recirculate, you can manual inject. In manual injecting, you start, and there you do have to stop, and it'll indicate to you the number of counts. So you can create a recipe or a number of counts for an automatic cycle the next time. That's it. No better system on the market today for professional light RTM injection than the Alpha 2, and it gets you there at a very reasonable cost.